All right. Found my mic, so better audio for these next few reviews. We're going to talk about Thomas Harris's third Hannibal book, simply titled Hannibal. But before we get into that, I need to just clarify something. The original film Manhunter, the first adaptation of Thomas Harris's works, was produced by a man named Dino De Laurentiis. A lot of you may know who that is. He's a pretty prolific producer. He was the one that insisted that it couldn't be called Red Dragon because he produced a movie that had dragon in the title and it bombed. Spoilers, Manhunter bombed. Not saying it's a bad film, it's quite a good film, but it didn't do well at the box office. So he relinquished the rights to the Hannibal books. By this point, I do believe Silence of the Lambs was pretty close to coming out. Silence of the Lambs was not produced by Dino De Laurentiis. Massive success. It is considered probably it's the most successful Hannibal movie ever. It's one of the best movies ever made, especially in like the suspense crime genre. It's a very well made film. And it was also the first time that Thomas Harris really had like huge success. He made a lot of money cuz when you're an author, it's not how much money you make per novel, it's more about movie rights cuz that's where the big money comes in. I mean, look at Stephen King. That says it all right there. But Thomas Harris, made a lot of money off of it, and I think that's why Hannibal became what it is. Unfortunately, Dino De Laurentiis got a hold of the rights again, and he insisted on certain things with the book. Specifically, the title. He wanted the title to be called Hannibal. Thomas Harris wanted this to be called The Morbidity of the Soul, which makes more sense for this book than just calling it Hannibal. It's probably the most lazy title of all of Thomas Harris's books, and it was just so. Dino De Laurentiis said, "This is what the book should be titled, and we'll leave you alone from there." Which he would not do the same with Hannibal Rising, but we'll get to that later. Hannibal takes place 7 years after The Silence of the Lambs. Clarice Starling's career's kind of falling apart with the FBI. Paul Krenler is someone who's also with the Bureau. He's trying to make some political moves, but he resents Clarice for her taking care of Buffalo Bill. And he's tried to ruin her career repeatedly and has done everything in his path to, like, just sabotage her. So when she ends up in a shootout with a known gangster and drug dealer, he capitalizes on this, and her competence is brought into question. Meanwhile, Hannibal Lecter reaches out to Clarice because she's become tabloid headlines again because she murdered a woman who had a baby. The woman was a known criminal, and was going to kill Clarice. In fact, shot Clarice, but that doesn't matter. The public thinks that she just killed a black woman, and it's big deal. Mind you, this is post Rodney King. This is the very late 90s. So race relations in America are not the greatest. So Hannibal reaches out to say that, like, basically that he's there. This tips off a rich man named Mason Verger. Mason Verger is a sick, sadistic, horrible human being that likes to torture people, torture children, is a PDF file, ju- and into incest. He is literally the most villainous character I have ever read in a book. But his big problem is Hannibal Lecter drugged him, because he was one of Hannibal Lecter's patients, and made him feed his face to his dogs. So he wants revenge. He can't. I mean, he's so badly damaged at this point that he's pretty much bedridden, and he is going to spend a bunch of money so that he can capture Hannibal Lecter and feed him to pigs because he's a big pig farmer. Um, Hannibal is tracked to Florence, where we have an Italian detective that's trying to hunt him down. Then chaos ensues. He comes back. Hannibal comes back to America, and that's where like this book really picks up because the Florence stuff's kind of wonky. So this book, the big thing with this book is it's really long, and it took a really long time to write. It shows the amount of detail in how Florence is into art, into Hannibal, even Hannibal's backstory. This is where we really start to get his origins, which will be continued in Hannibal Rising. We get Clarice. I think the goal was to make her more like Will Graham, where Will Graham's pretty jaded. The difference being she hasn't been horribly injured and out of the game for a long time. She's pulled out of the game in this, but it's just different. We also get the developing relationship between Clarice and Hannibal. A lot of people don't like. And I gotta talk about the big issues with this book. That is that Hannibal Lecter, he's still villainous, but he's sympathetic now. And I don't think it quite works. So that my biggest problems with this book, well, the number one is giving Hannibal Lecter a backstory. The reason Hannibal Lecter worked as a character was that he was sort of an enigma of narcissism and sociopathic behavior. He's just this entity. The fact that he's running around at the end of Silence of the Lambs is terrifying. Like it's like when Michael Myers disappears at the end of the first Halloween. You know, it's ruined by all the sequels, but like that's a crazy ending. And Silence of the Lambs has that going for it. Also, this book, I guess Thomas Harris's ego and his obsession with making a direct sequel to Silence of the Lambs really bogs this book down. Because making what he does with the Clarice's character is kind of sad and weird. And I have not been doing spoilers for these, but I have to give a spoiler now. The end of this book is incredibly controversial, and I think everyone knows that. And it's that Clarice is drugged and then made into a cannibal herself, and then she and Hannibal become lovers and they disappear together. And that's kind of how this book ends, is that she's making her own memory palaces, because that's the big thing in this book, is that Hannibal has these memory palaces, but his memory palace unfortunately has the death of his sister overshadows it, and this is about him moving forward. She was killed during World War II and eaten, which I will talk about more about in Hannibal Rising, because that's the driving force of that book. So I will not talk about it here necessarily. The Memory Palace idea is something I really like. It's probably my favorite part of this book. It's when we get good Hannibal Lecter characterization, because he doesn't. It's not like he kills like good people in this. It tries to kill just the bad ones, although you could tell that to the police officers he kills in Silence of the Lambs, or the nurse he ripped the tongue out of in that we're told about in all three of these books when he was still at the mental hospital. So I don't know. That's just something that's decided in this book. Um, but yeah, it was so controversial at the time that I think it overshadowed this book because this book's pretty good. It's not as good as the previous two. I'm not Stephen King, where, of course, Stephen King, dare I say it, the king of being a contrarian, says that this book is better than Red Dragon and The Silence of the Lambs, which is just not true. It's good, and it has its fans, and I totally get those fans. I'm one of them. I really like most of this book. I just don't. The whole thing with Clarice, there's not enough build up to her wanting Hannibal and wanting to be a part of that, because that was the whole thing with Silence of the Lambs, is that she was a good character. She was by the books, good, despite being like pigeonholed over and over again by her male counterparts because she was a woman. She still did the right thing, and she got Buffalo Bill. That's like the big thing with the Silence of the Lambs. She did right by not only herself, but what she thinks like her father would be proud of. Which that's brought up again in this. And there's some weird stuff I won't even get into because it's just kind of, in my opinion, nonsensical near the end. The last like few chapters of this book are just bizarre. Although it does lead to a one of the most disgusting scenes in all of these books. Um, but yeah, with I won't even call it torture, but it's just body horror. And this is a graphic book because Mason Verger is disgusting, just a disgusting, disgusting human being. Because in the previous books, we've got both Francis Dollarhide and James Gumb. They do horrific things, but they aren't textbook evil. They're not maniacal. They have their goals and their compulsions, and they're just mentally ill people. Mason Verger's just evil. There's no mental illness there. He's not a crazy person. He's just plain evil, which is kind of funny in a sadistic, awful way, but it gets taxing at times. Like, there's a scene in this where, and I'm going to talk about it because it really irritated me because there's like next to no point. So he likes to have foster kids brought to his mansion so he can watch them on his in his playroom because he's a pervert. He's disgusting. And he brings this little kid in, and basically this kid's going to get kicked out of his foster home because his foster mom got caught with marijuana. Anyway, so he just breaks this kid's heart and says that the cat they adopted is going to be put down, and in order to save the cat, he needs to feed the cat rat poison. That's in this. That's so messed up for no reason, and it resolves itself. There is a resolution to this that isn't horrific. I will just throw that out there. But I'm just like, why is this in here? There's a lot of why is this in here. The whole Florence section is just over the top. So initially, Mason Verger's plan is to have Hannibal eaten by pigs in Italy. And he has this porn director who also directs snuff films that's gonna film the whole thing. It's so ridiculous. With that being said, I really liked it. And then there's a really horrific death in the Florence part of the book. I will not spoil it. It's in the movie. It made it into the film that Ridley Scott directed, which a lot of this did. Um, but yeah, what would I give Hannibal? I give it a solid 4 out of 5. It's quite a good book, but it is a step down from the previous two, in my opinion. It's a little too long. There's just like some tangents. The Florence stuff's a little tedious. There's a whole section where Hannibal goes to a gun show, which is just weird political opinions. Also, this is like, in my opinion, the most dated of all these books because it really deals with early internet culture, like 90s internet culture, and it just doesn't age well, in my opinion. But this is well worth your time to check out. I do recommend reading it if you've read the previous two. Don't read this if you haven't at least read The Silence of the Lambs. Um, you need to read that to get this. You don't necessarily need to read Red Dragon, but I highly recommend it. But because they really don't reference Red Dragon in this, whereas like Silence of the Lambs, every once in a while they would reference Red Dragon. Um, but this is very dependent on the Silence of the Lambs. So anyway, have a nice day.